I trusted my best friend with every detail of my marriage problems. I cried to her, slept on her couch, and believed she was the only one on my side until I accidentally read a message that proved she had been secretly coaching my husband for months on how to manipulate me, gaslight my reality, drain me emotionally, and walk away looking like the victim while I was falling apart. They had no idea I was about to make them regret everything. I never thought betrayal would arrive dressed as concern, whispered advice, and late-night phone calls meant to support me, and for a long time I believed I was lucky to have a best friend like Claire. Someone who listened patiently while I spoke about the distance growing between my husband and me, someone who nodded sympathetically, held my hand, and told me everything I wanted to hear, all while quietly positioning herself closer and closer to the center of my life, into spaces she never truly belonged, until the day I realized that the help I had been accepting so gratefully was never meant to save my marriage, but to dismantle it piece by piece from the inside. My husband, Lucas, had changed slowly, subtly, in ways easy to dismiss if you weren't paying attention, his patience thinning, his affection becoming mechanical, his eyes drifting away during conversations as if rehearsing responses rather than listening. And every time I brought it up, Claire was there, soothing, reassuring, telling me I was overthinking, that men went through phases, that I needed to be more understanding, more flexible, more quiet, advice that always somehow left me questioning myself rather than his behavior, and I trusted her because she had been there for years, because she knew my fears, my insecurities, my weaknesses, things I had never even fully admitted to myself. What I didn't realize was that while I was confiding in her, pouring out my doubts and pain, she was collecting information, organizing it, refining it, turning my vulnerability into a blueprint. And Lucas began repeating phrases I had never heard from him before, sentences that sounded rehearsed, carefully structured, strangely familiar, until one evening it hit me with terrifying clarity that I had heard those exact words somewhere else, spoken in the same tone, with the same emphasis coming from Claire's mouth during one of our supportive conversations, and the realization sent a chill through me that I couldn't shake no matter how hard I tried. I started noticing the timing, the way Lucas would suddenly become distant after long phone calls with Claire, the way she always seemed to know details about our private arguments before I ever mentioned them, the way she encouraged space while quietly inserting herself deeper into both our lives, and the more I observed, the clearer it became that nothing about this was accidental, that the growing cracks in my marriage were being carefully guided, nurtured, expanded by someone who smiled at me and told me she only wanted the best for me. The moment that changed everything came unexpectedly, quietly, without drama, when I borrowed Lucas's tablet to look up a recipe and a message notification appeared on the screen, not hidden, not locked, as if fate itself wanted me to see it. And there it was, a conversation thread filled with late-night messages, strategic advice, carefully worded scripts on how to respond to me, how to avoid accountability, how to make me doubt my own instincts, and as I scrolled, heart pounding, breath shallow, I realized that Claire wasn't just comforting me while my marriage crumbled, she was actively instructing my husband on how to lie, how to manipulate, and how to slowly detach from me without ever looking like the villain. I didn't confront either of them. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I closed the tablet, placed it back exactly where I found it, and smiled when Lucas walked into the room, because in that moment I understood something that would change everything. I wasn't losing control of my life. I was finally gaining clarity. And clarity is far more dangerous to manipulators than anger ever could be. From that moment on, I stopped being the confused wife and became the quiet observer, the one who listens without reacting, who watches without revealing, who plans without rushing, because the people who think they are controlling the narrative often forget one thing. The person they underestimate is usually the one writing the ending, and I had just discovered exactly who my enemies were, how close they were, and how deeply they had underestimated me. Once the truth settled in my mind, nothing in my world felt accidental anymore. Every interaction replayed itself with new meaning, every smile now carrying intention, every helpful suggestion revealing a hidden edge. And I moved through my days with a calm I didn't fully recognize, listening more than I spoke, watching more than I reacted, allowing both Claire and Lucas to believe their plan was unfolding perfectly while I quietly stepped outside the role they had written for me, realizing that clarity changes not just what you see, but how you see it, and suddenly the manipulation that once confused me became painfully obvious. I noticed how Claire carefully timed her messages, always reaching out after Lucas and I had a disagreement, how she framed her advice to sound empowering while subtly encouraging distance, teaching him to appear patient while withholding affection, to sound remorseful without ever taking responsibility, and the more I observed, the clearer it became that she wasn't reacting to problems in my marriage. She was actively shaping them, guiding every fracture with deliberate precision, feeding Lucas' language, excuses, and strategies that allowed him to avoid accountability while positioning me as the emotional, unstable one. Lucas, meanwhile, grew more confident in his deception, repeating Claire's words as if they were his own thoughts, adopting her tone, her logic, even her phrasing, and I let him speak, nodding calmly while recording every sentence in my mind. Understanding that manipulators always reveal themselves when they think they are in control, and every time he tried to gaslight me, to make me question my instincts, I felt less hurt and more focused, less confused and more certain, because the pattern was undeniable, and patterns are impossible to unsee once recognized. I began testing the edges of their strategy, subtly changing my responses, withholding information, offering incomplete truths, and I watched closely as Claire grew unsettled, her advice becoming more urgent, more controlling. Her concern more performative, as if she sensed something slipping, and Lucas started making small but telling mistakes, contradicting himself, reacting defensively to harmless questions, exposing cracks in the carefully curated narrative they had built together, and I understood then that the greatest threat to manipulation is unpredictability, the refusal to play the role you've been assigned. What unsettled me most was realizing how long this had been happening, how deeply intertwined their conversations were, how effortlessly my trust had been weaponized against me, and yet instead of collapsing under the weight of betrayal, I felt something sharper forming, something steadier, because once you see the full structure of deception, you stop reacting emotionally and start thinking strategically, and I knew that confronting them too early would only give them time to adjust, to rewrite their story, to position themselves as victims, so I remained quiet, composed, observant, allowing the illusion of control to remain firmly in their hands while I prepared to dismantle it entirely. By the time I lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling beside a man who believed he was several steps ahead of me, I understood a truth that changed everything. They weren't winning because they were smarter, they were winning because they thought I was weak. And that assumption was about to cost them far more than they could imagine, because the calmest person in the room is often the one holding the sharpest blade, and I had stopped bleeding long ago. I didn't rush to expose them, because exposure without leverage is just noise, and I understood that what Claire and Lucas feared most wasn't confrontation, it was loss of control. So I began quietly building mine, collecting moments, saving messages, memorizing timelines, not obsessively but deliberately, the way someone prepares for a storm they know is coming, and the more patient I became, the more careless they grew, mistaking my silence for surrender, my calm for ignorance, never realizing that I had stepped into a different version of myself where emotions no longer dictated my decisions. Claire slipped first, not with cruelty but with confidence, sending me a message meant to reassure that revealed far too much, a suggestion wrapped in concern that exposed her awareness of conversations she was never supposed to know about, and I replied kindly, warmly, playing the role she expected while mentally marking the exact moment her mask cracked, because manipulators rarely stumble from malice, they stumble from arrogance, from believing they've already won. Lucas followed soon after, growing increasingly rehearsed in his apologies, repeating the same emotional structure, the same carefully timed pauses, the same phrases that sounded sincere but lacked substance, and I noticed how his stories no longer flowed naturally. How his explanations felt assembled rather than remembered, and every time I gently questioned a detail, his irritation surfaced too quickly, betraying the effort it took to maintain the lie, and I saw then how deeply he relied on Claire's guidance, how dependent he had become on her narrative to justify his behavior. I started creating distance without announcing it, changing routines, declining conversations, choosing solitude over explanations, and the effect was immediate. Claire's messages became more frequent, more invasive, while Lucas oscillated between charm and frustration, unsure how to regain access to the version of me he had learned to manage, and in their confusion, they began contradicting each other, small inconsistencies at first, then glaring ones. Timelines that didn't align, intentions that shifted depending on who was listening, and I quietly documented every fracture. What they failed to understand was that betrayal doesn't always provoke rage. Sometimes it produces clarity, and clarity is dangerous, because once you see people for who they are, you stop negotiating with them. And I had stopped negotiating long before they realized anything had changed, choosing instead to let them expose themselves fully, to allow their own words and actions to construct the case against them, knowing that truth is most powerful when it's undeniable and self-inflicted. By the time Claire attempted to steer me toward a decision she clearly wanted me to make, I recognized the desperation beneath her composure, the subtle pressure, the urgency disguised as advice, and I responded with silence, not defensiveness, not resistance, just absence, and that absence unsettled them more than any confrontation ever could, because control requires engagement, and I was no longer participating. As I watched their carefully coordinated strategy unravel, I realized something else, something far more unsettling than the betrayal itself. Neither of them truly understood me. They had underestimated my capacity to observe without reacting, to endure without breaking, and that miscalculation was about to become irreversible. Because I wasn't planning revenge driven by anger, I was preparing resolution guided by precision, and when the moment came, it wouldn't be loud, it would be final. The shift happened quietly, not with an argument or a dramatic revelation, but with a subtle imbalance they couldn't immediately explain, because suddenly the dynamics they relied on stopped working, their cues no longer landed. Their emotional triggers failed to provoke reactions, and for the first time since this all began, Claire and Lucas weren't directing the situation anymore, they were responding to it. Lucas noticed it first, not consciously but instinctively. The way someone senses when a door they always assumed would open suddenly stays closed, and his attempts to reconnect became oddly intense. Long messages filled with self-reflection that arrived without being asked for, apologies that felt premature, confessions that hovered just short of admitting the truth, and I listened without reassuring him, without correcting him, allowing his own guilt to stretch the silence between us until it became unbearable for him. Claire, on the other hand, approached with strategy rather than emotion, requesting a conversation framed as concern but structured like an interrogation, asking questions that revealed more about her fears than my answers ever could. And I watched carefully as she slipped, referencing details she shouldn't have known, moments she wasn't present for, thoughts she couldn't possibly have guessed unless she had been part of conversations Lucas swore were private, and I responded calmly, neutrally, letting her talk herself deeper into exposure. That was when I introduced the first disruption, not a confrontation but a boundary, small enough to seem insignificant, firm enough to unsettle them both, and the effect was immediate. Lucas reacted with confusion masked as hurt, while Claire reacted with irritation poorly disguised as patience, each of them revealing their priorities through their reactions, because when people lose control, they show you exactly what they were trying to control all along. They began speaking around me instead of to me, whispering in separate rooms, stepping outside for calls they pretended were casual, coordinating explanations that arrived moments too late to sound spontaneous, and I realized they were scrambling, attempting to realign a narrative that was already fractured beyond repair, unaware that every adjustment only highlighted the manipulation further, turning suspicion into certainty. I finally allowed a brief confrontation, not explosive, not emotional, just precise, asking a single question that neither of them was prepared for, and the silence that followed was louder than any accusation. Lucas froze, searching for the right answer, while Claire intervened too quickly, filling the space with justifications that weren't hers to give, and in that moment, the truth crystallized, not in words, but in behavior, in the way he deferred to her, in the way she spoke for him, in the way they both realized too late that I was no longer confused. What unsettled them most wasn't what I said next, but what I didn't say, because I ended the conversation calmly, without resolution, without forgiveness, without clarity, leaving them suspended in uncertainty. And uncertainty is terrifying to people who thrive on control, because it forces them to confront the possibility that their actions are no longer hidden, that consequences are no longer hypothetical, and that whatever comes next will not be shaped by them. As I walked away, I felt no triumph, no rage, just a steady sense of inevitability, the understanding that this wasn't escalating toward chaos, but toward conclusion, and that everything they feared losing was already slipping through their fingers. Not because I was attacking them, but because I had stopped protecting them from the truth, and the next phase wouldn't require confrontation at all, it would require execution. What truly unraveled them wasn't exposure, it was consequence, the kind that arrives quietly and settles in before anyone realizes the damage is permanent, because control doesn't collapse in one moment. It erodes when the systems holding it together begin failing one by one, and that's exactly what started happening once I stopped reacting and started moving. Lucas became restless in a way he couldn't hide anymore, his confidence thinning into desperation, his reassurances transforming into interrogations disguised as concern, asking where I'd been, who I'd spoken to, what I knew. Each question revealing a growing fear that the version of reality he depended on was no longer intact, and I answered gently, vaguely, never lying, but never offering enough to stabilize him either. Claire's shift was sharper, more dangerous, because she sensed the imbalance and attempted to correct it aggressively, inserting herself into situations she had no reason to be in, asserting opinions no one asked for, manufacturing urgency where none existed, and when that failed, she resorted to pressure, subtle at first, then unmistakable, reminding me of everything they'd done for me, as if generosity could be retroactively weaponized. That was when I allowed the first real loss to land, not dramatic, not announced, just precise. A resource they assumed was secure suddenly no longer accessible, a plan they relied on quietly invalidated, and the reaction was immediate. Panic masked as confusion, confusion disguised as anger, anger redirected toward me, because I was the variable they could no longer predict. Lucas confronted me late one evening, not with accusations, but with panic leaking through his voice, asking whether I still trusted him, whether we were okay, whether I believed in us, and I watched his face carefully as I responded honestly for the first time, telling him that trust wasn't something you declare, it's something that survives scrutiny, and his silence confirmed what he already knew, that whatever scrutiny was coming, he wouldn't survive it intact. Claire attempted damage control the only way she knew how, by rewriting history, minimizing moments that could no longer be denied, reframing manipulation as protection, deception as necessity, and I listened without interrupting, allowing her to speak until she contradicted herself, until the narrative collapsed under its own weight, until even she realized she was defending actions that no longer had justification. The atmosphere shifted after that, tension thick enough to feel, conversations shortened, movements calculated, glances exchanged when they thought I wasn't looking, and I understood then that they weren't planning their next move, they were bracing for impact. aware that something irreversible had already begun, even if they couldn't yet see its shape. What unsettled them most wasn't my resolve, it was my calm, the absence of emotional volatility they had learned to exploit, because without anger or pleading to react to, they were forced to confront the possibility that I wasn't acting impulsively. That whatever steps I was taking were intentional, measured, and already in motion. And as the tension continued to rise, one truth became impossible to ignore. This wasn't about repairing anything anymore. This was about survival. And they had finally realized that the narrative they built to protect themselves had become the very thing that would expose them, because once trust is gone, silence becomes strategy, and strategy becomes outcome. The cracks that had been forming for weeks finally became chasms, invisible at first, now wide enough to swallow every pretense they had maintained, and I watched Lucas stumble through the house with the weight of uncertainty pressing on him. Every glance over his shoulder betraying the panic he couldn't admit, every attempt to charm or explain dissolving under the clarity he no longer possessed, because I had shifted from observer to strategist, and the consequences of that shift were beginning to consume him. Claire, meanwhile, became frantic, her carefully maintained composure cracking in ways too subtle to notice if you weren't paying attention, and yet every slip revealed more than I could have hoped for, her insistence on explanations, her repetitive reassurances. The way she kept checking whether I had noticed something, anything, told me that the narrative she had built was collapsing around her, and that no amount of manipulation could stabilize it once the truth started moving. I let them make mistakes, small ones at first, because desperate people always reveal themselves, and the more I watched, the more audacious their errors became. Contradictions, slipped messages, hurried apologies, each a piece of the puzzle they thought they could control. And every fragment I collected drew a clearer picture of how deep the betrayal ran, of how thoroughly I had been deceived, and of how little they realized that their own arrogance had blinded them. The confrontation that followed wasn't explosive, not in the traditional sense, but it was devastating, because precision rarely needs volume. I asked questions softly, with deliberate pauses, with a calm that made their panic loud. And I watched Lucas falter, his rehearsed words collapsing mid-sentence, Claire stepping in too quickly, trying to rescue him, only to contradict herself, and in that silence that hung heavier than any argument, the truth struck harder than any confession could have. Every attempt they made to regain control failed spectacularly, because the subtle strategy one had employed for weeks now forced them to confront consequences they could neither redirect nor deny, and as they whispered frantically to one another, their tone fraying, their gestures uncoordinated, I realized that the alliance that had seemed unbreakable was cracking under pressure, exposing the vulnerability they had assumed I could never see, let alone exploit. By the end of the night, Lucas was exhausted, his face pale, voice brittle, eyes darting constantly, the confident man he had once been reduced to a trembling, uncertain version of himself, while Claire hovered, attempting to salvage a situation that had already escaped her grasp, and in their desperation, I saw the full magnitude of what patience, observation, and strategic restraint could accomplish. Control had shifted entirely, and I was holding it. For the first time since I discovered the betrayal, I allowed myself a small, private smile, not out of cruelty, not out of triumph, but out of understanding, because manipulation is most effective against the unsuspecting. And they had finally learned the hard truth. The person they underestimated, the one they thought was weak, silent, or naive, was quietly orchestrating the collapse of their plan, and the reckoning they had avoided for so long was now unavoidable, precise, and entirely irreversible. The reckoning arrived not with shouting or accusations, but with quiet inevitability, the kind of calm that terrifies people who have built their lives on control, and I watched Lucas sink into the chair, his hands shaking slightly. His eyes wide with the realization that everything he had relied on, every lie he had repeated, every manipulative gesture, had been undone with patience, observation, and strategy, and he knew, deep down, that there was no way to reclaim the ground he had lost. Claire, standing nearby, attempted to intervene, her voice laced with urgency disguised as reason, but it faltered under the weight of contradictions she had already created. Her carefully constructed explanations now collapsing under their own inconsistencies, and I listened silently as she exposed herself, piece by piece, every word betraying fear, desperation, and the knowledge that the game they thought they were controlling had slipped entirely from their hands. I finally spoke, not in anger, not in accusation, but in quiet clarity, recounting evidence, observations, and the precise patterns I had uncovered, and I watched Lucas's confident facade crumble completely, the rehearsed charm gone, the deflection meaningless, every micro-gesture betraying panic and helplessness, while Claire's attempts to manipulate the narrative further only deepened their exposure, and in that moment, I realized that control is a fragile illusion when met with patience, calculation, and unwavering observation. They tried to negotiate, tried to salvage fragments of the narrative, but every attempt was futile, every excuse transparent, every effort to redirect me met with silence and unwavering clarity. And I understood then that the reckoning had reached its apex. They were no longer the ones shaping the story. They were simply playing their roles in the conclusion I had already written, powerless to alter it, and fully aware of their own vulnerability for the first time. I left them there, sitting in the aftermath of their own miscalculations, a calm observer in a room charged with the tension of exposure, knowing that the consequences would linger long after my footsteps faded. That their arrogance and deception had been dismantled methodically, and that the lessons they would learn from this collapse would be permanent, because patience and observation are more devastating than anger, more precise than confrontation, and far more inescapable than any lie. The house was quiet now, the silence heavy, almost tangible, and as I stepped into the night, I understood a truth that would remain with me forever. The people who believe they are untouchable often discover too late that underestimating someone who listens, observes, and waits is the gravest mistake of all, and that in the end, the calmest, most patient person in the room holds the sharpest power, the one that cannot be bargained with, redirected, or defeated. And in that quiet, final moment, I knew without doubt that everything they had taken for granted, every manipulation, every betrayal, every hidden word, had been turned against them with precision. And the control they had believed was theirs had evaporated completely, leaving them to face the full weight of the truth, powerless, exposed, and utterly undone.